In the summer of 1847, the parish of St. Bartholomew in the French Quarter opened its doors for a wedding that no one among the invited dared to call a celebration. The building itself, with its thick plaster walls and narrow stained-glass windows facing Chartres Street, had witnessed hundreds of ceremonies over the decades, most forgotten within a generation. This one would not be forgotten. Not because of what was said, but because of what almost went unsaid, and because of the silence that followed it for nearly 40 years. Louisiana in that decade functioned as a society organized almost entirely by paperwork disguised as morality. Deeds, baptismal ledgers, marriage registries, inventories of property, both material and human. Every relationship, every transaction, every birth and death passed through the hands of notaries and priests who recorded lives in ink that was meant to outlast memory. It was, in theory, a system built for order. In practice, as later investigations would reveal, it was a system that could just as easily be used to erase a person as to preserve them. The bride was known in the plantation inventories only as Celeste, a woman of 23 years, held in bondage, whose uncommon beauty, quiet composure, and unusual bearing had made her a subject of hushed conversation in the parlors of the wealthiest households along Esplanade Avenue and Royal Street. Servants who had crossed paths with her in kitchens, courtyards, and market stalls described her in testimonies collected decades later, not as timid, but as watchful, a woman who seemed, in the words of one elderly domestic worker interviewed long after the war, to carry knowledge she had no reason to have and no permission to speak. The groom was Augustin Lavaux, a French merchant recently widowed, deeply indebted and entirely dependent on the goodwill of one of the most influential families in the region, the Valcourt. Etienne Valcourt, Celeste's legal owner, had arranged the marriage and presented it publicly as an act of mercy. In a private letter, later preserved among family correspondence and eventually donated to a historical archive, Valcourt described the union as a moral regularization. A rare gift, he insisted, offering a woman with no legal standing of her own a small measure of stability under the protection of a Christian household. Officially, that was the story repeated at dinner tables and in correspondence sent to relatives too far away to attend. Unofficially, according to at least 3 separate accounts written decades afterward by descendants of guests who had been present that day, everyone inside the church understood that the wedding existed for a different purpose entirely. A rumor had been circulating for months through notary offices, drawing rooms, and confessionals, a rumor no one repeated aloud in full, but one that had by the spring of that year traveled far enough to worry the Valcourt family, and by extension everyone whose fortunes were tied to theirs. The wedding, in the private judgment of the city's oldest families, was not a mercy, it was a correction. The disturbing detail, the one that would outlive every other memory of that day, occurred at the altar itself. In the seconds before the vows could be spoken, Father Henri Delacroix, a priest known for his meticulous record-keeping and his reluctance to involve himself in the affairs of the wealthy families who filled his pews, opened the old parish register to formalize the union. He compared the name written on the document delivered that morning by Valcourt's clerk against the name inscribed years earlier in the church's own baptismal ledger, a habit he maintained for every ceremony, regardless of the social standing of those involved. Witnesses recalled that the priest's hand remained still over the page for several long seconds. Then, instead of pronouncing the name written on the document before him, Celeste, woman held in bondage by the family of Valcourt, Father Delacroix read aloud a different name entirely, Madeleine Rosalie Beaumont. The silence that followed was later described in a letter written by one of the guests to a cousin residing in Baton Rouge as the moment every wealthy person in that church forgot how to breathe. No one moved. No one whispered. The organist, according to the same letter, kept his hands resting on the keys without playing a single note, as though even music understood that something had gone wrong. The ceremony stopped. Etienne Valcourt rose from his seat near the front of the church, and in a voice loud enough to be remembered independently by at least 4 separate testimonies collected over the following decades, demanded that the priest correct the record immediately. He insisted there had been a clerical error, a confusion with another family's documents, nothing more. Father Delacroix did not argue. He closed the register without a word. Celeste, or Madeleine, was escorted out of the church by 2 of Valcourt's men before any document could be signed, before any further word could be exchanged, before the congregation could do anything but sit frozen in their pews and pretend for the remainder of their lives that they had heard nothing unusual at all. The wedding was never completed. No marriage certificate bearing either name was ever formally filed, and the incident, rather than becoming public scandal, dissolved quietly into private memory, repeated only in careful whispers among people who trusted one another enough to admit they had been there. For nearly 40 years, the story survived only as rumor, softened with each retelling, folded into the kind of tale people mention at dinner tables without ever admitting they believe it. Some versions claimed the priest had simply misread an old document. Others insisted he had gone mad from the heat. A few, spoken only among older black residents of the quarter who had their own reasons to remember such things carefully, insisted that the priest had said exactly what he meant to say and that everyone in that church had understood him perfectly. It was not until the autumn of 1886 that the case resurfaced, and it did so entirely by accident. Thomas Armand, a free-born black archivist and schoolteacher living in New Orleans, had spent the better part of 2 years cataloguing water-damaged parish and municipal records as part of a broader personal inquiry into inheritance disputes tied to properties confiscated or contested after the Civil War. He was not a professional historian in any formal sense. His position at a small school for black children in the Faubourg Marigny paid little, and his archival work was done largely on his own time, driven by a conviction that the paper trail of the old plantation economy still held answers that mattered to the families who had survived it. He was not searching for Celeste when he found her. He was searching for patterns, names that appeared and disappeared across property transfers with suspicious convenience, signatures that recurred where they had no obvious business being present, dates that did not align with the seasons they claimed to describe. What he found instead was a folder, misfiled among unrelated municipal correspondence damaged by a roof leak years earlier, containing fragments of marriage, baptismal and sale records connected to the Valcourt estate. 3 separate pages bore the same peculiar irregularity. The name Madeleine Rosalie Beaumont had been scraped away with the edge of a blade in one entry, covered entirely in dark ink in a second, and crudely overwritten with the name Celeste in a third, the alteration visible only because the paper beneath the ink had begun to yellow unevenly with age, revealing the ghost of the letters underneath. Thomas did not immediately understand what he was looking at. His notes from that period, later preserved by his descendants and donated to a historical society in 1967, describe his initial reaction as simple curiosity, the kind any careful archivist feels when a document refuses to behave the way it should. It was only after he began cross-referencing the folder's contents with other sources that the shape of something larger began to emerge. He consulted old newspaper archives stored in the basement of a downtown printing house, most of them brittle and partially illegible, searching for any mention of the Beaumont or Valcourt families in the years surrounding 1825 and 1847. He examined auction receipts preserved by a notary's office that had since closed, records of the sale and transfer of enslaved people that listed ages, physical descriptions, and prices with the same cold precision used to catalogue livestock or furniture. He reviewed private correspondence donated years earlier by descendants of the Beaumont family to a local historical society, letters that had sat untouched and largely unread for decades. And he studied civil court depositions filed during property disputes after the war, when former slaveholding families fought bitterly over land whose ownership had become suddenly legally uncertain. What emerged from these fragments was not simply the story of an enslaved woman forced into a humiliating marriage to settle a family's reputation. It was something stranger and considerably more disturbing. According to municipal death records preserved in the church's own archive, Rosalie Beaumont, heiress to a modest but respectable estate along the river, daughter of a family with old ties to the sugar trade, had died in 1825 during a yellow fever outbreak that swept through the parish that summer, claiming, according to contemporary accounts, nearly 1 in every 20 residents of the city. She was 17 years old at the time of her recorded death, an age confirmed by her baptismal record and repeated without contradiction in every family document Thomas could locate. The details surrounding her death, however, did not agree with one another. The burial date listed in the church register did not match the date recorded independently in the cemetery's own ledger, a discrepancy of nearly 9 days that no explanatory note accompanied. The coffin, according to a brief note left by the undertaker's assistant and later transcribed into a civil inquiry filed decades afterward in connection with an unrelated inheritance dispute, had been sealed before any formal identification of the body took place, an irregularity the Beaumont family attributed, at the time and in every subsequent retelling, to reasonable fears of contagion during an epidemic that had already claimed hundreds of lives. Weeks after Rosalie's death was formally announced, the Beaumont family quietly transferred the remainder of their land holdings along the river to the Valcourt family. The transaction was never advertised in any newspaper Thomas could locate. It appeared only in a private ledger, buried among hundreds of unrelated entries covering unrelated years, the kind of document meant to be forgotten rather than read. A transaction, in Thomas's own words, written in the margin of his notes, conducted the way a family conducts business it hopes to bury alongside its dead. Decades later, Celeste appeared for the first time in the Valcourt household inventories, listed among the property of the estate with no recorded origin, no documented sale prior to her appearance, and an age on paper that did not correspond consistently with the physical description written beside her name by 2 separate overseers across different years. It was, Thomas wrote, as if she had been inserted into the household rather than acquired by it, the way a forged signature is inserted into a contract already signed. The people who had known both women, or believed they had, left behind testimonies that never quite aligned with one another, each account adding a layer of uncertainty rather than resolving it. An elderly seamstress, interviewed decades later by a local historian conducting an unrelated oral history project on domestic labor in the antebellum quarter, recalled dressing Celeste for the wedding in 1847 and noticing a distinctive scar along her collarbone. The seamstress insisted, with what the interviewer described as unusual conviction for a woman recalling an event so far in her past, that the scar was identical to one she remembered measuring on Rosalie Beaumont for a gown years before the fever swept through the household and, according to everyone she had ever known, ended the girl's life. A former employee of the Valcourt estate, in a signed statement collected during an unrelated property dispute in the 1870s, claimed that Celeste would sometimes respond, without apparent thought, to the name Madeleine, turning her head at the sound of it, beginning to answer a question before catching herself and falling silent again, the way a person reacts to a name they have spent years trying not to recognize. And tucked inside the folder, Thomas discovered was an anonymous letter addressed to Father Delacroix, undated, written in a careful and clearly educated hand, containing a single unsettling sentence that Thomas would return to repeatedly in his private notes. The bride does not belong to the man who sold her, nor to the man who wishes to claim her. Thomas spent months trying to determine who might have written such a letter and why. The handwriting did not match any signature he could locate among the Valcourt or Beaumont family correspondence. It did not match Augustin Lavau's known hand, preserved in a handful of surviving business letters. It did not match any of the clergy associated with St. Bartholomew during that period. Whoever had written it, Thomas concluded, had known something specific and dangerous, and had chosen to share only enough of it to unsettle a priest already inclined toward careful record-keeping, enough to make him look twice at a name he might otherwise have accepted without question. The deeper Thomas dug, the clearer the outline of the arrangement became, even as its precise center, who Celeste truly was, in the fullest sense, remained frustratingly, permanently obscure. The wedding, he came to believe, based on the pattern of documents surrounding it, had never been intended to unite Celeste with Augustin Lavau in any lasting or meaningful way. Its purpose was legal, not romantic, and certainly not merciful. Augustin, buried in debts he had accumulated following the death of his first wife and the collapse of a shipping venture, would marry the woman under her assigned name, formalize the union in the parish registry, and later, according to 2 letters exchanged between Augustine and a Valcourt cousin, both preserved by chance in a family archive eventually donated to a university collection in 1961, sign over any documents, claims, or property rights that might ever surface in connection with her. The logic, once Thomas laid it out in his notes, was almost unbearably simple. If Celeste were ever formally recognized, even in part, as Madeleine Rosalie Beaumont, meaning if the possibility ever gained legal traction that Rosalie Beaumont had not died in 1825, but had instead been declared dead and quietly removed from public life, then the entire chain of transfers, inheritances and reputations built upon her presumed death would collapse. The Valcourt family's claim to the Beaumont lands would become instantly, catastrophically uncertain. A marriage, properly recorded under the name Celeste, would erase any legal ambiguity forever. A woman married as property could not simultaneously be recognized as an heiress. The paperwork, once signed, would settle the matter permanently, regardless of what anyone privately believed to be true. Father Delacroix, Thomas concluded, after months of cross-referencing dates, letters, and testimonies, had not made an error that morning at the altar. He had made the only accusation available to a man in his position, a priest bound by professional discretion, financially and socially dependent on the goodwill of powerful families, unable to formally name a crime without evidence that would stand up to scrutiny, but unwilling to let the ceremony proceed under a lie. He alone, among everyone present, was positioned to recognize immediately upon opening the register. Reading her true name aloud in front of the assembled families of New Orleans was not a mistake, and it was not madness. It was the quietest and most dangerous form of testimony a man in his position could offer. What Thomas found most disturbing about the entire case, and what he returned to repeatedly in the private notes he kept throughout his investigation, was the absence of any single figure who could be cleanly identified as responsible for what had happened to Celeste. There was no lone villain hiding behind the story, no single hand that could be pointed to and blamed. There was instead a wide, ordinary network of complicity, notaries who processed altered documents without asking the questions their training should have compelled them to ask. Merchants and tradesmen who accepted convenient explanations because their own debts and futures depended on the continued goodwill of the Valcourt family. Clergy who, save for one moment of quiet defiance, remained intimidated into permanent silence. Neighbors and acquaintances who preferred not to know and who structured their entire understanding of the event around not knowing. And a family, the Valcourts, willing to let a woman disappear into another name entirely in order to protect the reputation, the fortune, and the bloodline they had built on land that may never have legitimately belonged to them. Celeste never appeared in any official record again after the day of the interrupted wedding. Some documents Thomas uncovered, fragments of correspondence between Valcourt family members discussing household logistics in the years following 1847, suggested she had been sent to a smaller property outside the city, far from the attention the wedding had drawn, and far from any curious eyes who might have recognized her. Others hinted, in the recollections of an elderly riverfront resident interviewed decades later, that a woman answering to yet another name had lived quietly near the docks, working as a laundress in the years following the Union occupation of New Orleans, blending into the anonymity that the war and its chaotic aftermath briefly offered to people the old records had tried so hard to erase entirely. Thomas was never able to confirm either version with the certainty a formal historical claim would require. What he did find, in the final months of his investigation, tucked inside the inner cover of Father Delacroix's own personal missal, donated years after the priest's death to the small archive maintained by St. Bartholomew's, was a single torn page from a prayer book. On it, in handwriting Thomas eventually matched to Delacroix's own correspondence through careful comparison, was written one line: "She knew her own name, and that alone was enough to condemn her." Thomas sat with that sentence for a long time before deciding what to do with everything he had gathered. He was, by every account left by those who knew him, a careful and deliberate man, unwilling to make claims he could not support, unwilling to accuse families still living and still powerful without evidence that could withstand challenge. He drafted several versions of what he wanted to say. Most he discarded. In the end, in the early months of 1886, he settled on the smallest, most defensible version of the truth he could construct. He published a brief notice in a local newspaper, tucked among announcements of church socials, shipping schedules, and municipal notices, the kind of item most readers would skim past without a second thought. He accused no one directly. He named no living family by name. He simply listed, in careful and measured language, the inconsistencies he had found across parish, cemetery, and property records. A burial date that did not match a cemetery ledger, a coffin sealed before identification, a land transfer completed within weeks of an unconfirmed death, a name altered 3 times across 3 separate documents held by the same church. Within the week, the parish records connected to the case disappeared from a locked archive room at St. Bartholomew's. No forced entry was ever reported to the authorities, no theft was ever formally investigated, and no explanation was ever offered by the church, whose records from that period, according to a later inventory conducted by a diocesan historian in the 1930s, were simply noted as incomplete, cause unknown. Months later, during an unrecorded renovation of the old cemetery where Rosalie Beaumont had supposedly been laid to rest in 1825, the headstone marking her grave was removed and never replaced. No permit for the work has ever been located in municipal records. No explanation was ever offered by the church or by the family that still, even at that late date, held considerable influence over local affairs. The grave itself, according to a cemetery survey conducted decades later, is now recorded simply as unmarked, disposition unknown, one among dozens of similarly ambiguous entries scattered across the older sections of the city's Catholic cemeteries. The only surviving trace of everything Thomas Armand uncovered is a partial copy he made by hand before the original documents vanished from the locked archive room. A copy rediscovered decades later, in 1967, among a collection of personal papers donated by his descendants to a historical society dedicated to preserving the records of free black communities in 19th century Louisiana. On that surviving page, in Thomas's own careful handwriting, the name Celeste appears crossed out. Beneath it, still legible after more than a century of storage in acid-damaged folders and humid archive rooms, are the words, Madeleine Rosalie Beaumont. Historians who have since examined Thomas's surviving notes generally agree on one point above all others. The horror of this case was never confined to what happened inside the walls of St. Bartholomew's on that summer morning in 1847. The interruption at the altar, however unsettling, lasted only minutes. What has proven far harder to explain and far harder to forgive is what the city did in the decades that followed. The quiet, collective, almost instinctive decision shared without any formal agreement among clergy, merchants, notaries, neighbors and families alike, to behave for the rest of their lives as though no one in that church had ever heard the priest read the bride's real name aloud at all. Somewhere along the river, in records that no longer exist, and in a grave that was never properly marked to begin with, the truth about who stood at that altar in 1847 remains exactly where the city left it, unresolved, unclaimed, and, by design, unremembered.